All right. Hello. There's a lot of people here. This is great. I'm Sam. I work at Lyft. You're at Lyft, so welcome. We're hiring, so there's that. I worked here like a year, done iOS since the beginning, and Mac before that. Mostly like small companies. This is my first like very large company for my standards. So I don't know. Learning a lot, and this is one of the things I've been learning, so let's talk about it. Yeah. Mobile design systems, very buzzwordy. We'll talk about what that is and why we care, what we're making, and some interesting tools and stuff. So the main point of this talk isn't, hey, use what we made, because you can't. We'd like to open source it. At some point, it's like on the list, but lower priority, obviously. So hopefully you're inspired by some stuff and learn some things, and you'll find something interesting, I hope. I'm very nervous about this being boring, so. All right, mobile design system. What is that? What does it mean? This is something that's not new at all. Like we've had constants for here's the colors we use in the app, and here's the button sim classes we've used for like 10 years now. But designers just recently heard of this thing of like consistency and reusability, and they're like, this is great. We're going to call it design systems. So we're like, yeah, sure. Like, we like that as well. I feel like most of the stuff around design systems is for React or like web stuff. There's not a lot of like mobile stuff. There's a few people here that do work on that, which is cool. But it's like a new-ish thing for us, so very excited to be working on it and learning. So yeah. A bit of context about like our needs and kind of how our system is set up, just so you know, I guess. Maybe it's interesting. And also to see context for like what I'm going to show in a minute. So we have two apps. One is for passengers, lovely marketing images, and one for drivers. They have very different needs. While you're a passenger, you're just holding your phone like people use phones. And while you're driving, it's mounted on your dashboard, and you're distracted, and it needs to be big and readable and large tap targets and that sort of thing. So on average, your phone's like 12 inches from your face normally, and now it's like over 20 usually. There's a bunch of like analysis and stuff. But basically that means screens where you're driving, we have larger type and bigger tap targets and that sort of thing. We're not like doing crazy eye tracking or trying to figure out if you are driving. The screen's designed to be driving, it's big, simple enough. So our system needs to be very scalable in the sense that it scales to larger sizes. Also, we have a pretty large team. There's 60 iOS engineers, 100 designers, 50-ish Android. We're hiring those as well. So yeah, that's kind of our thing. Also, we're building Android at the same time. Web is like kind of starting out. We don't have very much web stuff here relative to mobile. We also have autonomous vehicles that are like in the works, and they'll have like a big iPad mounted or some tablet with stuff, and that'll have different like needs and sizes and whatnot. So we're trying to think of all that ahead of time, because that's like the point, is like think this through and then do it once. So a few goals from like personally, I guess. There's a lot of goals for the whole project, but we wanted it to be very consistent, because that's like the point of the design system, is that it's like a consistent look and feel across all of our products. But also flexible. There's so many people, like we can't think of everything, or there's some new product like autonomous whatever, and they have some need that we hadn't thought of. They need to be able to do something off the beaten path, and that's okay. So those are like mutually exclusive goals. So finding some balance there on that spectrum is like a big part of it. We also wanted to feel really native, both from like a user. We don't want JavaScript. That's why we're at a Swift meetup. And we also wanted to feel like to the developer like very UI kitty. We're not gonna like redo our own thing in web technologies or OpenGL or some nonsense. It's gonna be like UI kit. So cool. So we called ours Lyft product language. I really fought for design system because that's what it is. But this is what we called it. So there we go. You'll probably see LPL like scattered around. So that's what that is. It's just our design system. Yeah, so it's organized into like a bunch of pieces. Here's kind of like the main ones. Principles is like it should be like consistent and it's like the design hand wavy like main themes, I guess. Then we have attributes. I know other people call this like foundation or whatever name. It's like the building blocks for the system. So notably like color and type and animation and that sort of stuff. Some of these are very work in progress, like 3D and illustration. But then on top of that, we build components. So using the attributes like our fonts and colors and what animation and whatnot to build our controls. And then we have templates, which I personally think of as just components, but it's like a component that has components in it. So whatever. All right. Yeah. So starting out, one of my main goals, thinking about like, okay, consistency, let's have a single source of truth because that'll help just inherently be more consistent. So kind of ish have this. Sketch still has a lot of stuff that's only in Sketch or is in Sketch and somewhere else. Eventually we'd love to like generate sketch files and have it literally be one source of truth, but down the road. So right now this looks like a repo with a bunch of JSON and other stuff in it. So like you're not intended to read this, but all our fonts are in one and all our colors and animation timing and shadow radiuses and like a ton of stuff. And that's worked really well for us. We actually define these with protocol buffers, which if you're not familiar, a coworker did a talk last Slug, and JP assures me the video will be up soon on gRPC and how we do networking here, which is phenomenal. Highly recommend protobufs if you haven't used them. Strong types are the best. So I started just writing like markdown documentation for how the JSON should be structured, and then realized that was stupid, and there's a thing for that. So switched to writing protos. Again, you're not just squint and there's code. Don't read it. Okay. So another thing in this like shared repo source of truth thing is a tool. It's a command line tool. If you have a better name, I'm all ears. I couldn't come up with something better. But it does a bunch of stuff, so I kind of want to talk through some of the stuff the tool does because I think it's maybe interesting. So we generate a lot of code. So here's a stencil template. If you've done any server-side Swift, you've probably seen stencil. It's like Mustache or Liquid or whatever by Kyle Fuller. Very nice. So the orange, I've kind of made up my own color in here, is like stencil stuff. Here's like a more complicated example. But you can see we're just like looping through a group, and then there's like another loop with some more stuff, and the details don't really matter here. But we're using this to generate like a whole bunch of Swift code from JSON files, which works really nicely. Like SwiftGen and all that, and sorcery and whatnot are fantastic, but it's like the input is Swift, and here our input is JSON, so it makes sense to use like a templating language. We have some nice helpers and stuff on top of this just to make writing these templates a little nicer, but it's a really dumb like wrapper around stencil, and it works really well for us. But having all this stuff in the tool and defined in protos enables a lot of other stuff. So yeah, we have all of our icons as SVGs in this repo as well, like single source of truth. And from that we can generate an asset catalog or generate like Android vector drawable stuff. It also generates like CSS for web people and XML and Java for Android people. The tool can find the nearest color in our set of colors. We have a very like locked down set of colors. So if you have some random hex, you can't use that. You have to use one of our colors. So there's a tool to like search in 3D space the nearest color. Linters for IB, other tools for IB, etc. So yeah. So let's take a closer look at like some of the details. That's kind of like a background of what we have and how it works somewhat. Color to me is really interesting. Not in the details of like how we pick them and all that, which is also a cool thing, but what we're generating is a struct that looks like this. So it just has a public UI color and then a private initializer that just forwards along. Nothing special here. But what's really interesting about this is we can make, and here's like some of that generated code, we can make a closed set of all allowed colors because the initializer is private. So all this code is in one file and can use the private initializer. So anywhere you see the type color, you know it's like an allowed, accepted color, and any instance ever will always be like an okay one, thanks to the type system. And we use this pattern quite a bit for here's the allowed like font styles or icons. We're not passing around UI images, we're passing around icons, so we know it's like an allowed one. Also, a bunch of them have like metadata for other stuff. Colors, like pretty simple, but yeah, I don't know. We don't really want an enum because you're not trying to enumerate all of the possible colors ever, but making a closed set is really, like with a private init, is a really nice pattern, I think. So cool. It's a boring one. This is hopefully more interesting. We're talking about controls. So hopefully you've used UI control. That's like the superclass of button and switch and all the things. We have our own subclass of control called control. That does a bunch of stuff. To me, is really interesting. And if you're making custom controls, I think you should be aware of all the stuff that it does. So let's talk about that. We care about accessibility a whole bunch at Lyft. If you're not sighted, taking public transit is a real pain. I can't even imagine. But taking, like calling a car and going where you need to go is awesome. Our accessibility contractor was saying today that almost all of his friends that are use accessibility features use iOS because like Apple stuff is far superior to Android. Cool. So we spend a lot of time, especially on iOS, on accessibility. So something we care about a lot. So just a brief thing on that. You should be setting accessibility traits on custom controls. This tells the screen reader how to read your control, and that's interactable and that sort of thing. So for example, if you set the trait button and then set the accessibility label to, next, it would say like button, next, and you're not gonna like write button. It doesn't like a different inflection and pauses in a cool way. You can't like do this on your own. You have to use the traits. Or if it's disabled, it'll say like button, next, dim, like in a, it's very nice inflections. Anyway, so you set like pipe accessibility trait not enabled to get that to say dim, which is weird. And if it's selected, you have another one and it says selected and whatnot. So doing this is kind of a pain, and all the system controls do this automatically, but UI control doesn't do it automatically, which is odd to me. So we have a way you set your base accessibility traits, and then this does it for you based on the other state. So kind of nice. If you're using this, you don't have to mess with it. We also have a way to customize like the path that VoiceOver draws, so they draw like nicely around our controls. I don't know, silly touch, but I'm really into it. All right. Another thing control does is greedy touch handling. So it steals a lot of touches, which sounds bad at first, but it's actually awesome. UI bar button item does this, or the view that that draws into. If you've noticed, you tap right under a bar button or a navigation bar, sometimes it takes the touch, like for like a plus button or something on the top right. Unless there's something that's interactable there, and then that'll get the touch. So we do a similar thing. We've defined our minimum size as 48 by 48 for interactive controls. The HIG says 44. Android says 48, so for consistency, we do 48. Also, 48 is in a multiple of 8, which personally is much more pleasing. So we'll do point inside and just call super unless one of the dimensions is less than 48, and then we'll expand and search inside there. So for things like checkbox that's really small for like our terms of service or whatever, you make it just like 32 by 32 or whatever it is, like, in code or IB or whatever, and then it'll automatically steal touches around it. You don't have to make it big with padding or something. We actually just changed the size of this to be even smaller, which is awesome. And we don't have to mess with it. Like, it's still going to steal touches from around it. So. There's also this method you should be implementing on custom controls I learned about recently. If you add a gesture recognizer to a view with a control subclass and not a button subclass, like a tap gesture recognizer, you will no longer get touches on your button, which is bad. So you override this and see if it's tap and it's one touch and there's only one touch required, then return false, so you take the touch instead of the gesture recognizer because they're tapping your control, which is probably what you want. I mean, you could customize it, of course, but yeah, control is a gesture recognizer delegate, TIL. All right. So let's talk about button. It's real exciting. it's a control and not a UI button, which I think is great. Button does a bunch of stuff that we didn't want explicitly. Like we don't want to change the title at different states or the image or the background color or whatever, or the background image rather. So we don't need button because one, it screws with the label constraints constantly, and we don't need any of those features. So we just subclass control, and with all that stuff we added just then, it's just fine. So here's what our button looks like. It comes in a bunch of varieties. Here's just a handful of them. Primary, secondary, primary elevated, and there's like a variation of that. It also comes in 3 sizes, so small, medium, and large. Handheld being like you're focused on the phone. And that's not necessarily like just passenger app or just driver app. The driver like sign up flow or edit your credit card or whatever, it's not going to be like enormous UI because that would be super annoying. But while you're driving, all the UI is super huge so you can reach it. So yeah, 3 sizes. So our button has 2 view models. No one, okay. I think that's hilarious. I mean, not like I would laugh at that, whatever. It seems weird, and I think it's awesome, but definitely weird, and I want to convince you that it's not stupid. So if you think it is after this, I'd love to hear, because I'm still nervous about it. All right. It has a size struct that has a font and a height, and it also has the activity indicator size, which is the same thing, basically, but another thing. So there's that. We'll get to mixing them in a second. And style has a whole bunch of properties for like colors and stuff, whatever. But then we can define these as like make a extension that defines like here's the primary style with like the details that don't matter. And here's the elevated style that's the same but just is elevated because it's just structs with mutable values. There's a lot of code. I'm not expecting you to like read all of this, just if you're curious, or watch the video later. Yeah, but it's composable. We don't have like in subclasses. With just the predefined styles, there'd be 15 button classes if we had one per size style combination. But instead, you can just initialize it like this, and it does the stuff for you. Also, if you want to make a custom one, you can. You don't have to subclass it. You can just configure the things. And as part of this, it's like everything that you can configure is stuff that we would be okay with you changing. And if you want to change something else, like please don't, from like the designer's point of view. But you can subclass it and go nuts, and that's fine. But I think this is a really nice pattern. Back to that theme, it's like if you're using one of our styles, then cool, you're like using the system, and that's great. But if you need to stray, you can. Here's some code that JP wrote. That he made a very small size that is not accessible because it's too small. But control makes it a bigger tap target, so fine, don't worry about it. So yeah, you can totally do this, and I copied that from our code today. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's neat because you can mix, and if we had more styles, we don't have to make like in more subclasses. You just kind of compose them. When we use this pattern a whole bunch, almost every control does this because every control, for the most part, works in the drive like setting as well. So they need to be large. Also worth noting that it's initialization time, and then after that they're immutable. Because one, we don't want you to like animate a button from like small to huge and back or something. That would be awful. Or change the style like mid interaction. One that would make the implementation really weird because you have to constantly handle that like all over the place. And also visually it would look bad. So that makes having it be immutable and initialization time makes it great. Kind of annoying in IB, but there's a thing for that, and it's fine. Yes. So next is State Animator, something else we made for our controls. It started out as a bunch of them had a ton of boilerplate for animations. Part of our like system is like it's designed, and then it's animated, and then it's implemented. Animation's like a first-class like big step for us. Questionable return on investment, I guess, but it looks nice. So we had a ton of animation code all over, and we have a bunch of like CA layer stuff, and that's like really verbose to animate. So we were just copying and pasting that constantly. Like button was like over 500 lines for a bit with just animation stuff. And that was like repeating, and I was like, okay, we've got to solve this because we have like a bunch of these now, and this is getting out of control. So we moved everything into like some controller thing, and then refactored it into like a protocol with a bunch of like implementations, and now it's like a generic protocol, and it's kind of evolved a bit, and I think that's worked really nicely. Not starting out trying to make some crazy generic protocol thing to animate our first component. It was kind of an organic like iterative process. So here's kind of the current state. It has an associated state, which is just hashable. Tie in there. It has a pacing and a curve. Pacing is just like a time interval container, like a color. So there's like named intervals you could do. Curve is like custom curves, like CA media timing or equivalent in UIKit. And then you can set the state, animated, and that's that for the protocol. Here's one of the like concrete ones in practice. So you make one for a view and pass in some view, and then you can say set identity for the transform key when it's in the normal state. And so awesome that it can infer identity from the key path. I was so pleased with that when I wrote that code. And then we have an extension on CG Find Transform for if something is elevated and you touch down, it like shrinks a bit. So there's a transform for that. And now this gives you a nice like pressy, shrinky button with like 3 lines of code, which I think is super cool. You still have to tell it like set state later when you press it, but yeah, very concise. First, that was like a ton of code before. Here's one that was even more. This is a layer 1. It's also generic, so it has like helpers for different layers. So if it's a shape layer, it adds fill color, for example, but if it's not a shape layer, it doesn't have that method. Since layers use strings for key paths and not key paths, there's methods instead of strings because it's safer. So purple 60 and purple 80 are like some of our colors from our color system. Like, don't worry about that. But you can see it's like it sets a color and then changes the color when you press it. We also have a struct for shadows, which is just all of the properties on CA layer for shadows. So you can like have a constant and pass it around instead of like setting like 6 properties every time you need to change one. So this is actually adding like 6+ animations to the CA layer for those last 2 lines each. So it changes the color and changes the shadow when you press it, plus the other thing shrinks it. This was like so much code before, and now it's like literally hundreds of lines changed to like be this slide. I'm very pleased with that. So yeah, I guess one note here about key paths. Key paths are a real pain to work with because once you have a reference writable one and you convert it to like a generic one, so you can put it in some, or like a less specific one, to put it in like a collection of some sort, you can't go backwards ever. You can't get a writable one out of it, which is super frustrating. So I found the best way to do this is right when you have it, make a block that sets whatever property, and then store that. So when you need to use it later, you just call the block you made when you had the reference to it. I don't know. If you haven't messed with keyfast, this probably doesn't make any sense, but hopefully that's helpful to someone. All right. And yeah, and that's what it calls. So there's a bunch of these. We have one that just does text color on labels because you have to animate that in an annoying different way than everything else. There's a group, so you can add a whole bunch of these together and just like talk to the group when state changes. Component state is like it's a wrapper around UI control state that has a couple other things for like if it's loading or not. Almost all of our controls can be loading because we don't want to show full screen spinners. We want to show a contextual one. That's the goal, not the current state. But there could be a custom one. For example, text field could have one for like the text is empty or it's the first responder or not or whatever. We don't want to have that in every component. We can like specialize it, and that's what made the protocol generic. Cool. So last thing, for a hack day or hackathon thing, a coworker and I, Kyle Bashor, we spent 2.5 days and made this thing called Paradigm that I'm like super excited about, but it's like a hackathon thing, so whatever. here's a video. I'll talk. Oh man, that contrast. Well, there's a box there. You can't really see it. Anyway, you can drag and drop our components onto this canvas, and then like edit them in this inspector thing, and like edit them live. So, yeah, whatever. I think this was really interesting, or like really fun to make. Also, as you change it, like it's changing the code, and you can like resize it. So those little like knobs are just controls with an animator to like set the color and the shadow and stuff. The thing that's drawing the little outline thing and the little handles is also a control that owns like a custom view. And if you set is editing, it hides or shows the border and the little knob things. It's got little guides. Here we're editing a text field with a text field. So meta, it's great. It's my typo, cool. And then you can hit this like play thing and like see it for real. So you see the little press down and the little spinner. And yeah, I don't know. I think that's like pretty neat. Designers were like over the moon about it. So yeah, I don't know. This was not that much work, even though it's like a ton of stuff. And to me, that was interesting. It was a lot easier than we thought it would be. I was originally like, hey, we should make IB for iPad. And everyone's like, that's totally stupid. You can't do that. But it's just UI kit. It's just like UI controls and gesture recognizers and whatever. Pretty easy, actually. And this was kind of like some people, this was like, oh, man, I had never thought that like tools are just apps. Like Xcode is just an app they work on with Xcode, I assume. I don't know. I mean, it's obviously crazy and a ton of complicated stuff. Same for like IB, there's crazy magic, but it's just like a thing, and you could totally make that, which is neat. I've seen people on Twitter like made an Xcode thing for iPad, which is cool. I don't know. That was really exciting. I had a lot of fun working on it. So the main takeaway is you can start small. Like we started with just like a component, which was a button. That was a silly amount of code because it did like tons of animation stuff. And we started with another thing, and that was a ton of code and not great, but it sort of worked. And we iterated a bunch to have like a bunch of this tooling to generate stuff and fancy animation wrapper things, and all the other things that we work on. So if you're at a company not with a dedicated person to work on your design stuff, just make some constants for your fonts and colors and make some button subclasses you reuse or whatever, and at least start with some consistency and like iterate. So I mean, that's all we're doing. We just have like more people working on it. So yeah, I don't know, just like go do it. It's great. That's all I have. Thanks.